Can you explain how your fingerprints got on this gun, which was used to kill everyone in the building at 110 East 40th Street?
Not bad, my ass. You gotta strain the remains for the fingerprints.
Tiny fingerprints. Stubby, tiny fingerprints.
Wow! Maybe the crooks left fingerprints on it.
You want me to put my fingerprints on that so you can frame me?
What does that make me out to be?
You're the kind of a stumble bum that left your fingerprints all over the room when you killed Phil Burns.
The story goes that the first ever crime solved by the use of fingerprints was in 1892 by an Argentinian inspector who identified the culprit of a murder by using a bloody thumbprint. There may have been other instances that predated this particular crime, but the fact is that fingerprints are one of a kind. No two people share them, not even twins. They are so singular in ownership that they've been offered as evidence to identify thieves, burglars, and even murderers. Have you ever looked at yours and wondered what's up with that series of grooves, swirls, and loops that's unique to you and you only? And why do we have them? They certainly aren't there to help solve crimes. They help build a case, but that's not their purpose. In an alternate universe where crime doesn't exist, we'd still have them. But why? If you've ever asked that question, you're not the only one. And we may finally know what they're for.
There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
When it comes to personal IDs, we have many. There's your driver's license, your passport, online username, among other human-made forms of proving who you are. Then there are those that nature gave you. That's yours and yours alone. Like your DNA or your fingerprints. We know what DNA is for. You can think of it like a cookbook. Each recipe in the book represents a specific gene, guiding the cell in creating a particular protein. The ingredients are the various molecules used, and the cooking instructions are the processes of transcription and translation that turn the genetic information into a functional protein. The end result of all of that cooking is you. But then there are your fingerprints. Other than leaving incriminating evidence behind if you've committed a crime and aren't careful enough to wipe them away or wear gloves, what are those fingerprints good for? If you lived in ancient Babylonia, you might have used your fingerprint to sign contracts. And as far back as 200 BC, Chinese officials recognized the individuality of fingerprints. And in 1892, the British polymath Sir Francis Galton published one of the seminal books on fingerprints. It was appropriately titled Fingerprints, in which he had chapters on patterns, twins, and parental hereditary influence, all complete with diagrams and images. If you didn't know how to take a fingerprint, he had a chapter on that as well. It goes without saying he was captivated by fingerprints.
My attention was first drawn to the ridges in 1888 when preparing a lecture on personal identification for the Royal Institution. Wishing to treat the subject generally and having a vague knowledge of the value sometimes assigned to finger marks, I made inquiries and was surprised to find both how much had been done and how much there remained to do before establishing their theoretical value and practical utility.
If he thought he had his work cut out for him, well, he did. He had enough to say on the subject to fill an entire book. The truth is, we know more about how we get our fingerprints than what the reasons behind them are. If they were designed by our internal cookbooks, our DNA, there had to be a reason for them, like adding garlic to pasta sauce. You'd notice it if it's not there. But would you know the difference if you didn't have fingerprints? Well, maybe. But back to their development. If I had a twin and we compared fingerprints, we might see the same main pattern, and we can thank our genes for that. But the similarity ends there. The main pattern breaks off into loops, into whirls, and breaks. We have chaos to thank for that. Chaos? Yes, the chaos of the womb. It's the womb's environment and a host of external pressures which change our fingerprints. The effects of gravity on how we are positioned in the amniotic sac, the density of the fluids, our movements, it all contributes to the formation of the prints. By the 24th week, the intricacies of the patterns are set in stone. The fingerprints we have at 24 weeks are the ones we will have for the rest of our lives. Are we alone in this? Well, chimps and gorillas have fingerprints, and that makes sense since we share a common ancestor or a common hominid ancestor around 6 million years ago, give or take a couple million. It's a good bet that ancestor had fingerprints. But what about 100 to 125 million years ago? Why that long ago? Well, that's when the last common ancestor between the line that led to hominids split from the one that led to today's koala bears. And why am I even bringing them up? Well, they are cute, but because they have fingerprints too. Other than the great apes, koalas are the only other species with fingerprints. The funny or fascinating thing about that is, if you were to look at them under a microscope, they would be almost indiscernible from ours. How can that be possible? Well, we can't say for sure, but it appears they, the evolutionary branch that led to koalas, developed fingerprints along the way in much the same way our ancient ancestors did. Perhaps they faced the same environmental pressures from living in the trees. And it's feasible. Having fingerprints, or an early form of them, like a mutation that allowed for ridges on the pads of the fingers, may have added a subtle sensitivity when it came to touching things, like tree branches and food. There may be a tactile advantage to fingerprints. By studying the benefits of them on koalas, it may help us understand why we developed our own. That's not to say there's a shortage of research studies focused on our prints. Well, there was a shortage. Prior to the turn of the 21st century, the fact that we had fingerprints was accepted and applauded by fingerprint analysts around the world. In the early 2000s, we began to see some real research done in the area to shed some light on those little ridges and twirls. The first we'll look at involves a study done in 2009 at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. For them, it was all about vibrations. When we rub our fingers across a surface, be it a rough or a smooth surface, we pick up tiny vibrations. These are picked up by microreceptors beneath our skin called Pacinian corpuscles. The receptors are very sensitive to changes in pressure and vibrations. They would still pick up these changes if we had smooth skin at the end of our fingers, but add some rough texture to them like ridges and swirls, and, well, you enhance that experience. The more we can sense, the better we can be at identifying objects by touching them. If the ridges were straight and parallel to one another, it would be a benefit to the touch sensation, but only if we rubbed our fingers back and forth to increase the vibration along the ridges. Having swirls and circles instead of lines negates that need. No matter how the fingers touch the surface, it contacts the ridges. More contact, more vibrations. And then there's sweat glands. Along with the Pacinian corpuscles, there's a high concentration of sweat glands beneath the pads of our fingers. A study done in 2020 used lasers to regulate how dry or wet the fingerprints were of its subjects. Imagine your fingers as high-tech grippers, always ready to hold stuff tightly, whether it's your phone or an umbrella. The study looked at 6 subjects touching glass, and through lasers, they saw that our fingertips release more moisture when touching hard stuff to improve grip. But if it gets too wet and slippery, the sweat pores are like, nope, we're done, and they close off. Our fingerprints also have this uncanny ability to speed up the drying process if there's too much moisture. All of this works together to make sure our fingers have just the right level of hydration. Now, this teamwork between the two biological tricks gives us abilities that other smooth-handed and smooth-footed animals just don't have. It's like our own little evolutionary superpower. Thanks, natural selection. But we're not done yet. We now know that moisture and vibrations help us navigate the world by the tips of our fingers, But what else can science teach us about fingerprints? At the University of Edinburgh, researchers Dennis Heaton and James Glover noticed that differences in how genes behave seem to follow a special pattern called a Turing pattern. The guy who first thought of this was Alan Turing, the famous mathematician. Now, he had this idea back in 1952. He believed that some natural patterns, like stripes and spots, could come about through two molecules. One's a slow mover, the activator, and the other's a speedy one, the inhibitor. The activator tells cells to do stuff, to make more of itself, and start making its inhibitor. The inhibitor, on the other hand, tells the cells to sort of pump the brakes on making more activator, which also means making less of itself. So they balance each other out, and this combo can create some really magnificent patterns like zebra stripes or leopard spots. It might even explain why our fingers are the way they are. Mice don't have fingerprints, but they do have striped ridges in the skin of their toes. Heaton and team played around with a specific gene to see how it would affect the ridges. Instead of the usual stripes, they got spotty bumps, something they figured was due to the Turing pattern. For us humans, this pattern starts at 3 specific areas on our fingertips, like near the nail, the fingertip center, and close to the knuckle crease. Then as it grows, these fingerprint ridges kind of spread out like waves from the starting points, meeting up in the middle and creating the one-of-a-kind fingerprint we all end up with. According to Heaton, it's all about how and where this pattern system kicks off that makes each fingerprint unique. And you probably thought fingerprints were boring.
Fingerprints won't help you at all. My fingerprints are all over those paintings. They're covered with my prints.
No, we're not looking for your prints.
What?
Do you remember the time that I was in your apartment and you came in with some paintings? And you said that they were watercolors and you wanted to evaluate them? And remember, I wanted to see them and you wouldn't let me? And I even touched them?
You touched...
Yes, my fingerprints are on those paintings. Now, if Mrs. Matthews is guilty, how could my fingerprints get on paintings that she stole?
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Evolution Talk. I'm Rick Coast, and if you find value in this show, please consider supporting it at evolutiontalk.com. I'd love to keep the show alive and without ads, and I can only do so with your assistance. So help spread the word, share the show with your friends, and at evolutiontalk.com you'll find more information, some recommended books on the subject, and also ways to contact me. I'd love to hear from you, and I hope your week is going well, and until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.